Hello everybody. In my video today, I'm going to be talking about Hannah Kent's use of historical documents in burial rites. Now, when it comes to looking at the historical documents, I don't necessarily think that there would be a question that is solely based on the historical documents. Although now that I've said that, there very well could be. But it's a really good idea to understand them and to really know how to analyze them to your advantage, because they can form some really strong evidence for so many different thesis statements. And I really think that most essay questions lend themselves quite well to utilizing the historical documents as a piece of evidence, and it could almost be one of your points or one of your arguments, depending on what it is that you are proving. Now, in burial rites, Hannah Kent has made the decision to start every single chapter with at least one historical document. Now, this in itself is important for us to understand, because we know that we're going to have to analyze the writer's choices throughout the exam, regardless of the question that we get. So Kent has chosen to start each and every chapter with some form of historical document. And what I've done is I've gone through each and every one of them, and I've just kind of had a look for any patterns and anything that is being suggested through this use of historical documents. So I've done a bit of a brainstorm, and these are the sorts of things that I think the use of historical documents really helps to construct throughout the text. So first and foremost, the historical documents allow Agnes's life and death to be documented. So we see through many of the different historical documents that there are public notices, there are transcripts from the trials, there are statements regarding the acts that's going to be used, but we also see information about Agnes's earlier life, and these sorts of pieces of information really help us to see her life in the way that it was documented. So if this novel didn't exist, these are the sorts of pieces of information that we have about her. Now, we can really start to see the sorts of ideologies and values and attitudes that are shaped through these historical documents, and when we have a look at each one, we'll really start to see that taking place. Now, the historical documents are often official and one-dimensional in nature, and we can really look at that as almost like a parallel with the way the society is structured, because it is also one-dimensional at most times, and that's a really good way to construct the society. And we'll see some patterns here that so many of these documents exist to construct the society. One thing that I think is really interesting is that the historical documents really highlight the fixed nature and like the permanency of Agnes's reputation, because these are documents from the 1800s and we are seeing them in this novel, and it to me just really helps to solidify the idea that the public perception of Agnes and the reputation that she had was permanent, and that she had no way of changing it because it's fixed, it's there, and no matter what she does, no matter how much of a voice she might be given, these documents are fixed, they are permanent. Documents also provide us with dates and times, so we get that kind of context from them in a really unique way. Historical documents are a point of truth, and I think if I had a question regarding truth or anything in that kind of area, the historical documents would be really interesting to touch on, because they are seen as a point of truth to some extent, and more than often than not, they are constructed by authority figures. So if I want to look at the fact that the truth within the society is dictated by those in powerful places, the religious men, then this is a really good example and a really good piece of evidence for that, because the historical documents are constructed and controlled by authority. Interesting to look at is that the historical documents really counter the voice that Agnes is given. So Kent allows Agnes to have a first-person narration style, right? So through that we get to know her insight, and Kent really gives her a voice in her story that would not otherwise been there. And the historical documents are such a stark juxtaposition and a contrast to this, because the prose that Kent uses for Agnes is so emotive. It's so strongly, it's just emotional, really. I always like to refer to it as angsty. Probably wouldn't in my exam, I might say emotive, but there's so much emotion there, and the historical documents are just a complete juxtaposition to that, because they are very factual, they are very to the point, aside from the pieces of poetry that are included, and we'll look at those in a second. On that note, the historical documents really ground the reader in between the tragic and emotive narration that exists. So even when it's in third person, it's a tragic text, and readers are constantly positioned to have an emotional response. It's very grounding to be placed back into what feels like, and perhaps that's a point in itself, this more factual this more factual kind of dynamic, but we know, we will see soon, that perhaps it's not as factual as it feels. Chapter 1 begins with a public notice, and it has come from Bjondel, and then we have some letters from Bjondel, and then the epilogue, so the way that the novel finishes, is also from Bjondel. So we can almost see that he is getting the first and the last word in the text. Now, that's an important point in itself, and Kent has done that on purpose. So even though we have this entire book really is all about the emotional nature of Agnes and her journey towards redemption and belonging and all of those kinds of things, the fact that Bjondel gets the last word, it kind of undoes all of that work for me. And it shows that regardless of the love and the humanity that is availed to Agnes, particularly through her time at Cornsar, Bjondel still got the last word. And we can look at that as evidence of the amount of power that the theocracy and the patriarchal. Now, obviously, before chapter 1, we do have the epigraph, which is from the saga, that says, "I was worst to the one I loved best." So that really sets us up for the novel, right? We have to think about the fact that Kent chose to open her novel with an excerpt from that saga. That's really important. And if you want to know more about that, I do have a video about the sagas. Okay, so chapter 1 opens with a public notice from Bjondel. And what I think is really interesting about this is that chapter 1 is obviously the first chapter in the novel, and this really establishes the tone of the text. Oftentimes when I'm teaching this novel, we have a lot of class discussions about how it's a little bit of a slow start. It feels a little bit dry at the beginning of Burial Rites, especially because it's action-packed. And I think that's important. I think that's purposeful. I'm not going to, in my exam, say that Burial Rites is a slow start, but what the monotony of it all at the beginning, I think, is very intentional. And by having this really dry and bland, and perhaps in the exam I might use the word bleak, public notice, it's really setting that up. So the fact that we start with a public notice about an auction really shows us the fact that there is a money-driven element to the society. I think it's really interesting that this is a public notice for Nathan's items that he left behind. So the novel is about Agnes and it's all about her story, but we actually hear about Nathan before we hear about Agnes. And I think that's really, really important. And I want you to have a think about why that might have been the case. Why has Hannah Kent introduced Nathan to us before she has introduced Agnes to us? And this is something that we could really use as an argument when we're looking at the way of which these characters are constructed, but also, again, those cultural assumptions and those societal values are really exemplified through this. What we also have here with this public notice is we have the establishment of Bjondel's authoritative tone, okay? So we see here that he is powerful, he is controlling, and he is the one that is really dictating what is going on, and that's shown to readers from the very beginning through this public notice. Still in chapter 1, we have a letter then to Reverend Johann Thompson, in which we have the theocratic values and I guess just the fact that it's a theocracy really established to us. The language that's used through these letters really highlight to us the way in which this society is structured. What I think is particularly interesting is on page 5 in the letter to Toti, so to Assistant Reverend Thorvador Jonsson, we get Bjondel's point of view of the murders. So the first, I'm really sorry if you can hear my cats, they want to be part of it, but not yet, maybe at the end. What we have here is we get Bjondel's perspective of what happened. So again, this is the first perspective that we get. So I think that that's really interesting because the novel is all about Agnes's perspective. Well, not all about, but you know, that's such a strong point of it, part of it, but we get Bjondel's first. So it's almost like we already know that Agnes is going to have to work really, really hard to undo what's established by Bjondel. And it's interesting because he says the Illagustera murders committed last year have in their heinous emblematized the corruption and ungodliness of this county. As district commissioner, I cannot abide societal waywardness. That is such interesting writing, and the language choices that he is making there are really, really interesting. We have to remember that this is a letter from Bjondel. So realistically, we're supposed to think of this as a really reliable insight into his attitudes and his values and his beliefs, remembering that those are three separate entities. So through this, we see that he has referred to the murders as being societal waywardness. So they are not what he stands by. And we don't yet really have insight into the problematic nature of this character. On the next page, what we see is readers are presented with Bjondal's one-dimensional perspective, even more so. We have concepts of power, authority, control, anything within that ballpark established really firmly through Bjondal's account of what occurred. Because Bjondal was not there, right? He wasn't there when the murders happened, but he is writing in a way that makes us think that he knows best. And finally, still noting that we are in chapter 1, the last little bit that we get from Bjondal in this letter that he is writing to Toti is a first-hand, really clear point of view as to how he feels about Toti. And there's no second guessing what he means when he says this. He says, "It is with some uncertainty that I approach you for this task. I am aware that your responsibilities have so far been confined to the spiritual education of your parish's youngest members, which is to say, of undoubted value, but it is of little political import. You may yourself admit that you are too pale in experience to know how to bring this condemned woman to the Lord and his infinite mercy, in which case I would not protest your disinclination. It is a weight that I would not hesitate to bestow on the shoulders of experienced clergymen." So we know firsthand how Bjondal feels about Toti. We also have a really good piece of information, and I don't know what I'm trying to say here. We have a really strong piece of evidence, there we go, for how Toti is viewed by his society. The too pale and experienced quote is one that I feel like we talk about all the time because it's a really, really good quote to use. But the fact that it's come from this historical document, the fact that this was said explicitly from Bjondal to Toti in his letter to ask him to do the job is so important because Toti accepted the position knowing that. He's also been given a really clear idea of what the expectations are of Toti. And I always talk about the fact that a fantastic question that I would just absolutely love students to be given would be regarding whether or not Toti fulfills his duties as Agnes's spiritual advisor, or whether or not he crosses a boundary in the way in which he carries out Agnes's spiritual advisement. And if that were to happen, that were the question that we were to get, we could really talk about the fact that it was made really clear to us from Bjondal's letter to Toti what it is that he was expected to do. Because it says that Toti will have the responsibility of preparing Agnes for meeting the Lord, visiting Cornsa regularly when the weather allows, administering God's word, and inspiring repentance and an acknowledgement of justice. If our essay question was about justice, this is a really cool piece of evidence that we could use as well. So this is just chapter 1 in terms of the historical documents. So there is so much here that we can use. Moving on to chapter 2, we have a lot less to talk about in chapter 2 because there's a much smaller amount of historical documentation. All we have is a letter from Bjarnson regarding Agnes's faith, I suppose. So we have an excerpt from the ministerial book, and this is where that great quote that we speak of so commonly about Agnes having an excellent intellect and strong knowledge and understanding of Christianity comes from. So this also makes me think about the part in the novel when Agnes says, she refers to this about like what the men have decided is most important about her, and I think that that's really interesting because it's exactly what this is. This is a really good example of the permanent nature of Agnes's reputation because she was so young. Even in this 19th century, they were able to go back and find evidence and go through the records and share in a permanent way about who Agnes was as a person. So the permanency of her reputation and what is important about her reputation to the people of 19th century Iceland is really exemplified through this quote and this historical document. Chapter 3 is an excerpt from the Supreme Court trials, and what I think is really interesting about this is that it's presented to us as from the Supreme Court trials, right? It's not signed off as from Bjondal. However, it's still Bjondal's perspective that we are getting through this historical document, because at the very end it says that the district commissioner was suspicious, and when the half-burnt bodies were revealed, he believed that those three had been a gang. So it's still Bjondal's opinion And the wording here is so important. He believed that they had been a gang. He didn't know. He doesn't have evidence. That's just what he believes. And it really goes to show the power that he has, because he is able to exert that as being fact almost. Chapter 4 begins with a letter from Bjondel, and what I think is really interesting about this letter is the difference in his tone, because he's talking to the deputy governor of Northeast Iceland, and the way that he's writing is so different to how he was writing when he was talking to somebody like Toady, for example. Even the fact that he signs off with, "I am your excellency, your most humble and obedient servant," is such a juxtaposition to how Bjondel usually carries himself. And that's really interesting. I think it says a little bit about his character. Chapter 5's historical documents are so interesting because they're so different to the rest of them. And we have a bit of poetry here. So we have a poem from poet Rosa to Agnes, and then we have Agnes's reply. And this adds a layer of emotion and almost melancholy to the plot. And it's such a contrast to the other historical documents, and I think that's really important for us to notice. I also just think that it really adds to the public perception of Agnes. And if I got a question about that, I think I would really want to talk about this poem from Rosa, because she's so sure of Agnes and who she is, and she's so ready to conform to this idea about her that she has written this poem. And if we listen to it, it's incredibly profound and incredibly emotive. "Don't be surprised by the sorrow in my eyes, nor at the bitter pangs of pain that I feel. For you have stolen with your scheming he who gave my life meaning, and thrown your life to the devil to deal." I also think that's really interesting that I know we speak so at length about how stupid, and I would probably use the word perhaps ignorant, or just desperate for love that Agnes was to go and believe and live with Nathan and all of that kind of stuff. But at this point, poet Rosa is saying that it was he who gave her life meaning. So Agnes isn't alone in falling into Nathan's spell, and this is some strong evidence for that. Also, the fact that Agnes replies is so interesting, because I don't know if this is something that I would have expected from her. And her reply is so profound, because it says, "This is my only wish to you, bound in anger and grief. Do not scratch my bleeding wounds. I'm full of disbelief. My soul is filled with sorrow. I seek grace from the Lord. Remember, Jesus brought us both, and for the same accord." Really consolidating the fact that she has an excellent knowledge of the Bible, right? And it's like, it almost feels like primary evidence that she has that understanding and knowledge of Christianity, which is just such an interesting thing to think about. But also the fact that she publicly replied shows us this level of perhaps introspect from Agnes that we might not have otherwise known that she was capable of having at this point in her journey. Chapter 6 is one of my favorite historical documents. I just think there's so much to talk about here. And what we have is a list of the possessions that Agnes has and a list of the possessions that Seeger has. And it's just so almost harrowing to think about that both of them owned such few things that they were able to be itemized, and that it was to the point of saying, like, number 2 for Agnes is an old blue skirt with a blue bodice of plain woven wool with a red collar and 8 silver buttons. So she owned such few things that we are counting the amount of buttons. And obviously it's a different time, and the wealth in Iceland was not strong as is, but Agnes was so poverty-ridden. We know that she grew up on a porridge of moss and poverty, that she owned such few things when it came to her being condemned. But what's interesting is, in contrast to that, how much less Seeger has. Obviously she has a sheep, so that's pretty significant if we look at the cost per item, but she owns way less things than Agnes does. If I wanted to talk about wealth or class or anything to do with ownership in terms of like property or economic status, this is such good evidence for that. And also that this was made public is really important, because we know that Agnes had that reputation for being a pauper, and that's what Nathan liked about her, if you ask Agnes. So the fact that it then became like public knowledge, I think is just really, really interesting. Chapter 7 starts with a testimony from Reverend Johann Thompson, and this is about Friedrich. So what's interesting, I think, is the last sentence in here where it says, "I have not, except for 4 years, been a priest in this parish. However, such is my opinion that he has been raised with too much freedom." A really interesting essay question would be on freedom. But even if we're looking at anything to do with control or to do with restriction, isolation, any of those kinds of concepts, it's the public expectation that people don't have freedom in this society. Interesting that I think it's also worth mentioning that this says that where it says, "I learnt of his greatly unbending character." So that was worth noting in this time. These historical documents just do such a great job of contextualizing the times and the places for us and knowing what it is that people expected and, more importantly, what they valued. In the same chapter, we then have a letter from Bjondel to Toady where he is questioning Toady about how he's traveling with Agnes. Chapter 8 starts with another poem. So we have a poem from Rosa to Nathan, and again, I quite like these poems because I love poetry, but also because they just add another layer of understanding for us and just more context, particularly when it comes to the poems. The poetry from Rosa to Nathan really provides us with an understanding of how it maybe wasn't Agnes's fault. That's my opinion, but the fact that Rosa fell victim to Nathan as well is really important. And this poem here is, again, deeply emotional, really profound, and provides that emotive layer that's needed in between chapters. And it says, "Oh, how happy I believed I was. No one could have known how free, even when I suffered for you, when everyone was mocking me." If I told you that those were Agnes's words, what's interesting, however, is how this poem continues. And it's the second stanza of it says, "Traitor, look at your misfortune. These are my thoughts, they're true. Oh, how this rose of Kazisgard has gone and poisoned you." So that's referring to Agnes. And the symbolism there is really important to think about, but also just, again, this public perception and this idea of who Agnes was and what people thought of her. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Sometimes when I make videos, it's hard because I can't check that it makes sense. So please let me know if it doesn't. Chapter 9 is so interesting, and I don't think we talk about it nearly enough. It starts with another poem, this time an anonymous one, and it says, "Leading the way for women, a poet named for Magnus. His blessed blood flows in her veins, the good Berthel Agnes." So this is obviously about our friend Agnes Magnusdotter, but it's anonymous, and we want to think about why that might be. Why, when there's something positive being said about Agnes, is it anonymous, whereas everything else has a name to it? Not everything else, but most things have a name to them. It really exemplifies just how much the people of 19th century Iceland, in their theocratic patriarchal society, were not going to go against the grain, and they were not going to challenge things. So that signifies to us how significant it is when characters like Toady do challenge the societal values and views of Agnes. Chapter 10, again, starts with a piece of information that's anonymous. And it's really important because it talks a little bit about Rosa, and we get pretty much everything we know about Rosa from these historical documents, but this one in particular is really interesting. So it says, "Rosa was asked to appear at court. She declined to give any information about the case, but she said that Agnes came sometime that winter to her and spoke well about her master Nathan. Nothing unusual that she can say about Agnes or Siga, as she doesn't know them well." Isn't that interesting? Because she had such things to say in her poems, but when it comes to this sort of setting, she has nothing unusual to say. This highlights to us the multifaceted nature of what truth is in this society, and the fact that there are so many different accounts of things that happen, and we really don't know what on when and where and who we can trust. What's also interesting about this piece of information is that it talks about Friedrich expressing to Rosa that he desires her, and then Rosa rejecting him, and that shows us a little bit more about Friedrich. And what an interesting question it would be if we got one about Friedrich, because I feel like we know so much about him, even though he's not really in the plot that much, but I just think it's interesting to think about the fact that he pursued Rosa in that way. And what's interesting is that Olaf, Rosa's husband, came to her and told her that Frederick had asked to see the storeroom so he could look for the money he thought Rosa kept for Nathan. He said that Nathan had told him he could take the money if he ever managed to sleep at Rosa's place. If there's one thing in this world that Frederick loves, it's money. This confirms that. We already knew that, but this confirms that. Chapter 11 also starts with a document that is provided from an anonymous source. And this one is all about Frederick killing sheep. So it says that Bjarni Sigurdsson, who's Frederick's brother, who was 10 years old but looked to be clever and intelligent. How does somebody look clever and intelligent? What do you think that in this society somebody that is clever and intelligent might look like? After a long time of questioning, gave no information, but just that he had slit 2 sheep throats and 1 lamb's while his father was not home. Interesting, right? Bit of foreshadowing, I feel. Chapter 12 starts with an excerpt from the saga, and we all like to get a little nervous about a saga question. We know that I think a saga question would be great. This is interesting because we know that Burial Rites is a little bit of a mirror to the Laxdela saga. So let's have a read of this. It was like, I've only got 1 chapter left in me, but I have all these historical documents. Let's just bam, 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 put them all in there. So the first one that we have is a letter from the secretary of the King of Denmark, because we know that Denmark had ownership over Iceland at the time. And it's to Bjondel, and it talks all about the sentencing. So it gives us some information regarding that. Then we get a reply from Bjondel, in which he quite firmly is addressing the district officers and telling them who needs to attend this execution. I think it's really interesting that it says, these farmers are obliged to attend. If they don't obey your directions, they will be penalized. It is recommended that you warn these men who will have the most difficulties leaving their farms or traveling about this. Please also note that you yourselves must be at this event. So obviously it has to be this big public affair that has to occur. And it reminds me of when somewhere Agnes says they mean to make an example of me, and this confirms that. Then the final historical document that we get, aside from the one in the epilogue, so the final within the actual novel, is the Icelandic burial hymn. And it says, I think upon my Saviour, I trust his power to keep. His mighty arm enfolds me, awakening and in my sleep. Christ is my rock, my courage. Christ is my soul's true life. And Christ, my still heart knows it, will bear me through the strife. Isn't this ironic? This is such strong irony, because Agnes does not come to this, really. And this is what Toady was supposed to be preparing her for, these kinds of beliefs and this kind of way of thinking. But Agnes doesn't really get there. We have a little bit where she's like, maybe I should have gone to church more. But I don't believe that Agnes is thinking that, Christ is there bearing her through strife. But we have this here as a reminder of, like, that was what was supposed to happen. And this is what is playing throughout the chapter. And it's quite harrowing to think about that. Right before Agnes is executed, when she is losing the plot, as we would expect, she can hear this Icelandic hymn. And this is one of the final things that Agnes hears. And I think that's really interesting. Okay, well, that's me going over the historical documents. Hopefully you found that helpful. I don't think you need to memorize the historical documents. I don't think you need to go into the exam and provide data and say, this many historical documents are this is this, this is that. But having a knowledge of this can be really helpful for providing evidence in your exam. And we know that we have to talk about